What if one man decided the fastest way to end a war was to make war more terrifying than anyone had imagined? What if victory no longer meant defeating armies alone, but breaking railroads, factories, crops, morale, and the belief that resistance could continue? What if flames moving through the South changed not only the American Civil War, but the future of modern warfare itself? This is Sherman's fire. By 1864, the war had become exhaustion. For 3 years, the United States had bled, cemeteries expanded, treasuries strained, families lived by casualty, lists, factories worked day and night, fields lacked sons and fathers. The Confederacy still resisted fiercely. The Union still struggled. To finish the conflict, President Abraham Lincoln faced re-election under terrible conditions. Many Northerners were weary of death. Critics called the war endless. Some demanded negotiation. If battlefield success did not come soon, Lincoln might lose power, and if Lincoln lost, the war's purpose, and perhaps the Union itself, could be endangered. In the West, one Union commander had already proven relentless: Ulysses S. Grant. Grant understood that the North's greater population and industry could win through sustained pressure. He was promoted to command all Union armies in 1864. Grant's plan was broad and brutal. Keep Confederate armies engaged everywhere. Do not allow rest. Do not allow recovery. Use the Union's material advantage continuously. In the East, Grant personally confronted Robert E. Lee. In the West, another hard-driving general would strike deep into the Confederacy. His name was William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was intense, intelligent, restless, and often misunderstood. Earlier in the war, some thought him unstable after he warned of the immense scale of conflict to come. In truth, he had seen reality before many others. He believed war was cruelty, and because war was cruelty, pretending otherwise only prolonged it. Sherman did not celebrate suffering. He believed concentrated suffering now might shorten. Suffering later? It was a grim logic, but one that would shape history. His major objective in 1864 was Atlanta. Atlanta was no ordinary city. It was a railroad hub, a manufacturing center, a logistical heart of the Confederacy in the Deep South. Its fall would wound Confederate war capacity, and Northern morale would soar. To take it, Sherman moved from Tennessee into Georgia, with roughly 100,000 men divided among multiple armies. Opposing him first was Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston was cautious, skillful in retreat, and determined to preserve his army. Again and again, Sherman advanced. Again and again, Johnston withdrew to new defensive positions. The campaign became a chess match across hills, rivers, forests, and rail lines. Places like Dalton, Resaca, Kennesaw Mountain, and the Chattahoochee River became names of maneuver and blood. Sherman preferred flanking movement when possible, rather than smash directly into entrenched lines every time. He often moved around them, forcing Confederate withdrawal. Yet not every move succeeded. At Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in June 1864, Sherman launched frontal attacks and suffered heavy losses. Even relentless generals learned hard lessons. Still, the pressure never ceased. As Johnston gave ground, Confederate President Jefferson Davis lost patience. He replaced Johnston with the aggressive young General John Bell Hood. Hood was brave, wounded multiple times in previous campaigns, and willing to attack, perhaps too willing. Around Atlanta, Hood launched repeated offensives against Sherman's larger forces. The battles were fierce. Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, Ezra Church, Jonesboro. Confederate losses mounted. Each failed attack weakened the army defending the city. Meanwhile, Sherman targeted what truly sustained Atlanta railroads. Tracks were the arteries of Civil War armies. Food, ammunition, reinforcements, mail, medicine, and mobility depended on them. Cut the rails, and cities suffocated. By early September 1864, Hood could no longer hold. Confederate forces evacuated Union. Troops entered Atlanta. The news exploded across the air. North church bells rang. Newspapers celebrated Lincoln's political prospects, transformed almost overnight. Many historians view Atlanta's fall as crucial to Lincoln's re-election in November 1864, but Sherman was not finished. Taking Atlanta was one thing. Ending The Confederacy was another. He now proposed something radical: march an army across Georgia to the sea, living off the land when necessary, destroying military infrastructure, and demonstrating that Confederate authorities could no longer protect their own interior. Some in Washington worried. What if he became isolated? What if supplies failed? What if Southern forces trapped him? Sherman was confident. He cut many traditional supply lines and moved in late 1864 with about 60,000 troops toward Savannah. This became the famous March to the Sea. His army advanced in broad columns. Bridges were seized, depots emptied, warehouses burned, cotton stocks destroyed, railroads torn up, heated rails were twisted around trees into loops nicknamed Sherman's neckties. The destruction was not random chaos alone. It targeted the South's ability to continue organized war, but civilians inevitably felt the shock. Plantations were stripped of supplies, livestock taken, mills ruined, fences burned for fuel. Homes were sometimes looted. Not every Union soldier behaved lawfully. Not every officer controlled men equally. Some communities suffered heavily, others less so. Memory afterward would magnify, mythologize, defend, condemn, and reinterpret these experiences for generations. For enslaved people, Sherman's columns often meant something very different: possibility. Thousands fled plantations and followed Union armies. Some sought family members sold away years earlier. Some offered labor and guidance. Some simply walked toward freedom because blue uniforms had appeared. Scenes of joy, confusion, fear, and uncertainty mixed together on Georgia roads. Freedom was arriving, but not yet secure. Sherman's march also carried psychological power. It proved a Union army could move through the Confederate heartland almost at will. The myth of Confederate invulnerability was burning with the depots. When Sherman reached Savannah in December 1864, he captured the city largely intact. He famously telegraphed Lincoln, offering Savannah as a Christmas gift. The phrase became legend. Then came the Carolinas campaign in 1865. Sherman turned north through South Carolina and North Carolina. South Carolina held symbolic significance, the first state to secede and cradle of secessionist fire-eaters. Union destruction there was often harsher. The burning of Columbia remains historically debated, caused by a mix of retreating Confederates, cotton fires, wind, drunkenness, and Union actions. But the result was devastation. As Sherman moved north, Confederate resistance weakened. Railroads were broken faster than repaired. Food was scarce. Civilian morale collapsed. State governments staggered. The Confederacy was being compressed from multiple directions. Grant and Lee locked in Virginia. Sherman moving through the Carolinas. Union naval power strangling coasts. The Mississippi lost. Resources fading. Could the war have ended without Sherman's methods? Historians debate this intensely. Critics argue his campaigns inflicted unnecessary hardship on civilians and normalized total war. Defenders argue that targeting infrastructure and morale shortened the conflict, ultimately saving lives that prolonged battlefield fighting would have consumed. Both perspectives engage real moral weight. What is clear is this: Sherman helped transform war from contests between armies into struggles involving entire societies. 20th century warfare would carry that logic on terrifying scales. Yet Sherman himself did not seek indiscriminate massacre. Compared with later modern wars, Civil War destruction remained limited in many ways. He generally sought organized ruin of war-making capacity rather than wholesale slaughter of civilians. Still, for those who watched barns burn or fields emptied, theory mattered little. War had come home. Politically, Sherman's victories mattered enormously. Lincoln won re-election in 1864 against George B. McClellan. That meant the Union would continue fighting to unconditional restoration rather than negotiate separation. It also strengthened the path toward emancipation as permanent policy. Without battlefield success, politics might have turned differently. By early 1865, many Confederates knew the end was approaching. Letters spoke of hunger. Shoes were scarce. Rail transport failed. Desertion rose. Hope thinned. Yet armies still fought because institutions do not collapse all at once. They crack, then bend, then suddenly break. Sherman's fire was one of the forces creating those cracks. When people imagine Civil War battles, they often picture lines of soldiers charging across fields. But wars are also won by supply, movement, economics, morale, and time. Sherman understood that better than most. He struck not only bodies, but systems. And when systems burn, armies soon follow. The next chapter would move eastward, where Robert E. Lee's legendary army, starving, trapped, and exhausted, would make its final desperate marches. Because after Atlanta, after Savannah, after the Carolinas, the Confederacy was still alive, but it was dying.
What if the most feared army in the Confederacy did not fall in a single dramatic defeat, but slowly collapsed under exhaustion, hunger, and time itself? What if a legendary general who once won impossible victories finally discovered that courage alone cannot replace food, ammunition, and men? What if the final chapter of the American Civil War was not a glorious last stand but a quiet surrender after a long, grinding retreat? This is Lee's last march. By early 1865, the Confederacy was no longer a rising force. It was a shrinking circle. Railroads were broken, cities were starving, factories were silent, soldiers were barefoot. Families were desperate, the once powerful dream of independence was now reduced to survival. At the center of what remained stood one army, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. For much of the war, Lee had been the Confederacy's shield and sword. He had defeated larger Union forces. He had invaded the North. He had inspired loyalty bordering on devotion. To many Southerners, Lee was not just a commander, he was a symbol of endurance. But by 1865, symbols could not feed soldiers. Lee faced a reality no amount of strategy could fix. He was running out of everything. His army defending Richmond and Petersburg was stretched along long trench lines, defensive works that foreshadowed the modern warfare of the 20th century. Opposite him stood the relentless Union commander, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's strategy was simple and unforgiving. Keep pressure everywhere. Do not allow Lee to rest. Do not allow him to rebuild. If necessary, accept heavy casualties, but never stop advancing. For months, the siege of Petersburg dragged on. It was not one battle. It was a grinding lock of trenches, artillery, raids, tunnels, and exhaustion. Soldiers lived in dugouts carved into the earth. Rain turned trenches into mud. Disease spreads easily. Food supplies dwindled. Men aged quickly in the dirt. Civil war had become something closer to industrial attrition. Inside Richmond, the Confederate capital, panic grew. Bread shortages worsened. Inflation spiraled. Women lined up for food. Riots broke out. Government officials struggled to maintain order. President Jefferson Davis tried to project resolve, but the system beneath him was failing. Lee understood the truth before most leaders admitted it. Richmond could not hold forever, and if Richmond fell, the war's center of gravity would collapse. On April 2, 1865, Grant launched a coordinated assault on Confederate lines at Petersburg. Union forces finally broke through key positions. The breakthrough forced immediate evacuation. That night, Lee sent a message to Davis: Richmond must be abandoned. The Confederate government fled the city. In the early hours of April 3rd, Union troops entered Richmond. Smoke rose in parts of the city as fires spread during evacuation chaos for enslaved people in Richmond. The moment was historic. Many left plantations and neighborhoods, seeking freedom as Union soldiers arrived. Some followed troops, some searched for family members, some simply stood in awe at the collapse of a system that had defined their lives for generations. Meanwhile, Lee's army withdrew westward. This was no longer a march toward victory. It was a retreat toward uncertainty. He hoped to link with other Confederate forces and continue resistance in the field, but every mile west revealed worsening conditions. Rail lines were destroyed, supplies were gone. Federal cavalry shadowed his movements constantly. Grant pursued aggressively. The retreat became a race, one army trying to escape, Another trying to end the war, Lee's columns moved through Virginia roads under constant pressure. Soldiers discarded equipment they could no longer carry, horses collapsed. From exhaustion, men searched for food in abandoned farms. Desperation deepened. Still, Lee hoped. He believed that if he could reach the interior, gather supplies, and unite remaining Confederate forces, a final defensive stand might be possible, but hope was narrowing. Grant's forces blocked the routes ahead. Sheridan's cavalry struck. From the sides, the Confederacy's remaining structure was unraveling around Lee's army like fraying cloth. At the Battle of Sailor's Creek on April 6, 1865, disaster struck. As Lee's army attempted to move west, Union forces attacked stragglers and supply columns. Confusion spread quickly. Entire Confederate divisions were cut off, surrounded, and captured. Lee reportedly watched portions of his retreating army collapse and said in essence that the loss was devastating beyond words. He had lost not just men, but the structure holding his retreat together. After Sailor's Creek, Lee's situation became critical. His army was reduced, exhausted, and nearly surrounded. He pressed toward the small village of Appomattox Court. Housed there, he hoped to find supplies waiting from Confederate forces further south. Instead, he found Union cavalry blocking the road. Grant's army was closing in from multiple directions. Lee now faced a final truth. There was nowhere left to go. No reinforcement was coming. No breakout was possible. No resupply existed. Only surrender remained. On April 9, 1865, Lee requested a meeting with Grant. The two men had known each other in the Mexican-American War years earlier, but had not met in person during the Civil War. They met in a modest home owned by Wilma McLean. The contrast between them was striking. Lee wore a formal Confederate uniform, carefully presented. Grant arrived in a simple, dusty uniform, stained from travel. The meeting was calm, respectful, and restrained. There was no shouting, no humiliation, only the quiet end of a vast conflict. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home. Officers could keep sidearms and horses for planting. No mass imprisonments. No public executions. Lee accepted. He said he would advise other Confederate forces to surrender. The Army of Northern Virginia ceased to exist as a fighting force. When news spread, reactions varied. Some Confederate soldiers wept. Some felt relief. Some felt disbelief that years of struggle had ended so simply. Some refused to accept it at first, but surrender has a way of becoming reality faster than belief can adjust. In Washington, Union celebrations erupted. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered. Soldiers fired salutes. The war that had consumed the nation for years was nearing its final collapse. Yet even as Lee surrendered, fighting had not fully stopped elsewhere. Confederate forces in other regions still held out briefly, unaware or unwilling to accept the outcome immediately. But the center had fallen, and once the center falls, the edges soon follow. Lee himself did not act with bitterness after surrender. He urged former Confederates to accept peace and rebuild. He understood the South had lost not just a campaign, but an era. In the days after Appomattox, Union soldiers and Confederate prisoners often passed each other in stunned silence. Some shook hands, some avoided eye contact, some simply stared. Unable to process that the enemy was no longer an enemy, the war had ended in the field, but emotionally it still lingered in minds shaped by years of violence. Then came the most tragic twist, just days after Lee's surrender. President Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated in Washington. The man who had guided the Union through its darkest trial would not live to see peace fully restored. Lee's last march had ended, but America's struggle was not yet complete. The next chapter would deal not with generals or battles but with rebuilding a shattered nation. Because surrender ends the war on paper, But healing a broken country takes generations. What if the man who carried a nation through its darkest war never got to see its peace? What if victory itself came at the exact moment the United States lost its guiding voice? What if the end of the American Civil War was not celebrated with community, but shattered by a single bullet in a crowded theater? This is Lincoln's death, April 1865. The war was ending. The Confederacy was collapsing. Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox just days earlier. The long nightmare of civil war was finally closing. In Washington, D.C., people poured into the streets. Church bells rang across cities. Soldiers fired celebratory salutes. Flags waved in the spring air for the first time in years. Many Americans felt something like relief. The Union had survived. Slavery had been legally destroyed through war and constitutional change. A fractured nation was being stitched back together. At the center of it all stood the man who had carried the burden of that survival, Abraham Lincoln. But victory had changed him. Those who saw Lincoln in 1865 described a man visibly aged beyond his years. His face was lined with exhaustion. His eyes carried grief from thousands of telegrams, battlefield reports, and personal losses. He had buried a son during the war. He had endured constant political attacks. He had made decisions that weighed on his conscience daily. And yet, he had preserved the Union. Lincoln's vision for the post-war United States was not revenge. It was reconstruction. He believed the defeated South should be restored to the Union as quickly and peacefully as possible. He spoke of malice toward none and charity for all. He wanted healing, not humiliation. But not everyone agreed. Radical voices in Congress demanded harsher punishment for the Confederacy. Some wanted a long military occupation. Some wanted the political exclusion of former Confederate leaders. Some wanted deep restructuring of Southern society beyond the abolition of slavery. Tension over Reconstruction Huaderi before peace was fully settled. Lincoln, however, remained focused on unity. In early April 1865, he returned to Washington after visiting battlefields. One of the most powerful symbolic moments occurred in Richmond, where formerly enslaved people greeted him as a liberator. For many, Lincoln represented not just the Union, but freedom itself. On April 11, 1865, Lincoln delivered one of his last public speeches. He discussed the racontant use of Louisiana and suffrage for educated black men and soldiers. It was a cautious step toward expanding rights for formerly enslaved people. It also provoked anger in some extremist circles. Among those listening to the end of the war was a man named John Wilkes Booth. Booth was a well-known actor in Washington theaters. He was also a Confederate sympathizer. As the Confederacy fell, Booth became increasingly radicalized. He believed Lincoln was destroying the South. He believed vengeance was justified. And as the Union celebrated peace, Booth began to plan something dark. His original idea was kidnapping. Then sabotage. Then the assassination. Booth gathered a small group of co-conspirators. They believed that killing Lincoln and key officials could destabilize the government and revive Confederate resistance. It was a desperate, delusional plan born from defeat. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington. The play was a comedy titled Our American Cousin. The atmosphere inside the theater was light, audiences laughed, candles flickered. Uniformed guards were fewer than usual, many assigned elsewhere due to the war's end. Lincoln arrived with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. They sat in a private box overlooking the stage. At the same time, Booth entered the theater. He knew its layout well. He knew security routines. He waited for the right moment. As the play reached a comedic high point when the audience erupted in laughter, Booth moved. He entered the presidential box. He raised a small pistol and fired. The shot struck Lincoln in the back of the head. Time fractured in that moment. The president slumped forward. Mary screamed. Chaos erupted in the box. Booth leapt onto the stage below. He shouted something believed to be sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. Then he fled into the night. The theatre, moments earlier filled with laughter, became epileptic. Doctors rushed in. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house owned by William Peterson. He was laid on a small bed in a cramped room. Medical understanding of brain trauma in 1865 was limited. There was no hope of recovery. Throughout the night, officials, friends, and family gathered. Outside, word spread rapidly through Washington. Shock replaced celebration. The nation had lost its president at the moment of victory. At approximately 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. The war's leader was gone. The man who had preserved the Union did not live to guide its peace. Across the country, grief erupted. Church bells rang in mourning instead of celebration. Black crape draped buildings. Trains carried the funeral procession northward. Crowds lined railway tracks for miles, silently watching the coffin pass. For many Americans, it felt as if the nation itself had been wounded at the exact moment of survival. The hunt for Booth began immediately. Federal troops and detectives searched across Maryland and Virginia. Booth fled with accomplices, crossing rivers, hiding in barns, and moving through sympathetic networks. For days, he evaded capture, but the net tightened on April 26th. Union soldiers surrounded a tobacco barn in Virginia where Booth was hiding. The barn was set on fire or pressured to surrender. Accounts differ in detail. Booth refused to come out. He was shot and killed inside. His conspiracy collapsed completely. Other conspirators were captured and tried. Several were executed. Others imprisoned. The nation demanded justice, but also struggled to understand how peace could begin with such violence. Lincoln's funeral became one of the largest public mourning events in American history. His body traveled by train through multiple cities, mirroring his earlier journey to Washington years before. Millions viewed his coffin. Many wept openly. Some could not comprehend how a man who had led them through war could be gone just as peace arrived. His death created an enormous historical rupture, because Lincoln was not only a president. He was a stabilizing force between radical demands and national survival. Without him, Reconstruction would unfold differently than he had envisioned. In Washington, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency. Johnson was a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union. He now inherited the enormous task of rebuilding the defeated Confederacy, but Johnson lacked Lincoln's political skill, patience, and moral authority. Conflicts between the presidency and Congress quickly escalated. Radical Reconstruction policies emerged. Southern resentment grew. The fragile hope for unity became strained almost immediately. Lincoln's absence was deeply felt in every debate. His balancing instinct firm, but conciliatory, was gone. What remained was a political struggle over how to define victory. Yet Lincoln's words continued to shape the nation. His vision of a united country of the people, by the people, for the people became a guiding ideal even when reality fell short. For formerly enslaved people, his death was especially complex. Many mourned him as the president who ended slavery. Others feared what would happen without his leadership. Freedom had been declared, but its protection now depended on institutions still under construction across the South. Reactions varied. Some celebrated the fall of Lincoln as symbolic relief. Others feared the consequences of assassination during the fragile peace. Many simply faced the exhaustion of survival in a devastated region. Lincoln's assassination ensured that the end of the Civil War would not feel like a clean conclusion. Instead, it became a transition filled with uncertainty. The war ended, but its meaning was still being fought over. In time, Lincoln's image would grow beyond politics. He would become a national symbol of unity, sacrifice, and moral struggle. His speeches would be studied, his life mythologized, his decisions are debated, but at the moment of his death, none of that future clarity existed. There was only shock, only silence, only a nation realizing that the man who had guided it through destruction would not guide it through rebuilding. The Civil War ended with the surrender at Appomattox, but it closed its most tragic emotional chapter in a small, dark room in Washington, where a wounded president drew his final breath while peace outside was still new, fragile, and uncertain. And in that contradiction, victory without its leader America entered the next phase of its history. Not war, but the struggle to define what that war had truly cost, and what kind of nation would emerge from its ashes.